Now let me introduce you to our next speaker, who's Professor Bina Agarwal. I've left my notes down there, so I'm going to introduce Bina off the top of my head. She's a professor of economics at Delhi University. She is a very eminent climate scientist, has worked a lot on gender, the interface between gender and green growth, and today she's going to talk to us about green development issues from the point of view of water and how to make sure that the poorest citizens of this earth share in green growth. I hope I've got it more or less right, Bina. Over to you.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here. This is such a wonderful event. Friends, let me ask, what sort of world do we want to live in? I believe we want a world that is pro-poor, pro-development, and pro-environment. But such development would be a far cry from the standard economist's measure of human well-being, namely GDP per capita. Now, that measure takes no account of the environmental costs of growth, of deepening inequalities, or the many facets beyond income that impinge on the quality of our lives today and tomorrow. Facets such as nutritious food, good health, political freedoms, and most of all, a clean, green, and sustainable environment. Now, such multidimensional, green, and inclusive development will need more than green growth. And achieving this will need cooperation at all levels, from the global to the local, and both between countries and within communities. I'll illustrate this and ask you to consider two major challenges we face today: food security and forest conservation, among many other challenges. Global hunger, we know, is widespread. But even in high-growth economies, hunger and malnutrition persist. 90% of the hungry and undernourished are in South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa, the red part. Even without climate change, we will need extraordinary efforts to feed 9 billion by 2050. With climate change, the task is mammoth. For sustainable food security, we must increase food production, reduce waste, and secure equitable distribution. Now, food security is both a national and a global concern. And what is of particular note are the serious regional imbalances in production, exports, and imports. So almost all low-income food deficit countries are in Asia and Africa, and food surplus ones are mostly in developed regions. Now, this leaves importing countries very vulnerable to policies in exporting countries. For instance, if you have shifts from food to biofuel production in the United States due to government subsidies, this can adversely affect world food security, as can other aspects like meat-intensive diets. So as some countries seek security, others could become insecure. To reduce such dependence and enhance food security overall, we need higher production, and we need it especially in Asia and Africa, where most of the world's population and of the world's poor live. Now, what you find is that almost 60% of workers in Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa remain trapped, mostly in low productivity agriculture. And this trap is gendered. Women are much more dependent on agriculture than men, and increasingly so as men move to non-farm jobs, so as you see from these graphs. In Asia and Africa, women constitute 40 to 50% of agricultural workers, and we're seeing a feminization of agriculture. Small farmers, especially women, will thus play an increasingly important role in the food security of these regions. But they face wide-ranging constraints. Most have minute, unirrigated, and fragmented plots. So in South Asia, 80% cultivate 2 hectares or less. Few own their land. Women are especially disadvantaged. And in much of Asia and Africa, for instance, less than 20% of landowners are women. Moreover, there is growing onslaught on small farmer land from corporate agriculture, from the biofuel industry, from manufacturing, and from governments. And this pressure is both national and international. Many countries, China, South Korea, India, Saudi Arabia, Sweden, have been securing millions of hectares in Africa for biofuels or crops. Compensation is often poor and usually goes to male heads of households. There are also well-documented class and gender biases in access to technical information, to credit, to extension, to inputs, to storage, and marketing. Few smallholders can move to efficient, skill-intensive agriculture, which we sorely need. This seriously restricts their output, while large farmers overuse groundwater and chemical fertilizers. Climate change will add to these pressures. Yields of the most important staples are expected to fall in aggregate terms. South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa could be especially hard hit unless we do something about it. Reducing small farmer constraints, however, could substantially increase production. According to the FAO's 2011 State of Food and Agriculture report, reducing the constraints simply for women farmers could raise their yields by up to 30% and raise total agricultural output in developing countries by 2.55 to 4%. How do we reduce these constraints? I believe a critical ingredient will be cooperation between communities and across countries, and it will involve both technological and institutional choices. So, for instance, technologically, we know that irrigation can substantially raise yields. But should we go for large dams, or should we go for local irrigation systems? Large dams have high human and environmental costs. Community-managed irrigation systems can conserve water and provide an alternative. In India, for instance, long-term agricultural growth has been barely 3% or so per year. But in one state of Western India, agriculture has grown at around 10%. And a key factor has been groundwater recharge with community-managed rainwater harvesting systems. So to revive old irrigation systems and to create new ones, we need community cooperation. Similarly, it is difficult for millions of small farmers, especially women, to individually overcome production constraints. Normal market mechanisms tend to fail. So what's the answer? An answer lies in enhanced cooperation between small peasants. Now, cooperation can be at many levels. It could simply involve pooling your funds for joint investment in irrigation. It could involve working together for crop planning and buying inputs, machinery, and crop insurance. Groups can also substantially raise small farmer access to land by enlarging their fund pool and can increase their clout with government agencies and so increase their access to credit, inputs, and information. But gains in output and social empowerment could be especially high if small farmers also pool their land to form what I term agricultural production collectivities. Potentially, such collectivities could help smallholders take advantage of economies of scale, move to higher value, more risky crops with higher payoffs, share labor, and bring together a greater diversity of skills and deal better with climate change. Can this potential be fulfilled in practice? I believe so. There are numerous examples from Asia and Latin America of small farmers jointly investing in irrigation, or collectively purchasing inputs, or marketing via cooperatives. Many, many advantages here. Amul in India has 2.5 million mostly poor animal owners selling their milk through cooperatives. But most notably, we have examples of group farming. We find these in the transition economies of Central Asia and Eastern Europe. Many households voluntarily pool their land in small groups after decollectivization in the 1980s and 1990s to overcome input constraints. Research shows that these cooperatives have much higher output than individual family farms. Now, unlike failed socialist collectivization, which was top-down and coercive, these groups are voluntarily formed, small-sized, participative in decision-making, and equitable in produce distribution. Here's an example from Romania. Similarly, in South India, some 35,000 women's groups are cultivating jointly, some supported by NGOs, others by local government. They lease land in groups, they pool their own plots, they preserve their own seeds, they practice organic farming and multiple cropping, and reduce the risk of crop failure and provide a balanced diet. But for a hunger-free world, we also need international cooperation. Key areas of cooperation are research on water-conserving, heat-resistant, low-chemical crops, saving seed diversity, creating regional food buffer stocks, price stabilization, and so on. So this is as far as food security is concerned. I do want to take up the second challenge, which is the issue of, has both implications for global and local cooperation, namely forest conservation. Now, we know that forests are sources of biodiversity, they are carbon sinks, but for millions, they're also critical sources of fuel, fodder, and gathered food. In a 2005 survey in India, village women identified 79 species of uncultivated leafy greens which they gather for food, apart from roots and fruits. And the same is true for Africa. Forest decline undermines biodiversity, and this also critically affects nutrition supplements for the poor. To conserve our forests, global treaties on climate change and global financing of REDD+ are important, but not enough. We also need cooperation among communities which have a major stake in forests. In the 1990s, there was global recognition of state failure in forest conservation, and 50 countries moved toward some form of community forest management. For instance, today, India has over 100,000 community forestry groups involving over 8 million households and about a fifth of the forest land. Now, between 1991, when the program was launched, and 2001, forest cover, which was declining rapidly, increased by 3.6 million hectares. Here's just one story of one village before and after 5 years of protection. As Elinor Ostrom has argued so persuasively, user involvement is essential for building enduring institutions for governing the commons. But in my own research, I took this argument forward by examining the impact of women in forest governance. I found through detailed empirical analysis that groups with a higher proportion of women had substantially better conservation outcomes than groups with few or no women. There were 50% greater probability of forest conservation in women-inclusive groups. Including women improved protection, reduced rule violation, and increased the ecological knowledge base. Women's impact was especially high where they had a critical mass of 25 to 30% membership in forest management committees. And landless women made a particular difference, so you have a win-win here. REDD+ is an important global initiative to reduce emissions for deforestation and forest degradation. But it relies too heavily on monetary incentives and not enough on institutional innovations, which promote participation and cooperation, especially of women and the poor. Finally, of course, scaling up is important, from the local to the national and further up. But this need not be huge sizes. Rather, the answer lies in alliances and federated structures, such as this example. Nepal, in fact, has a country-wide federation of forest user groups. 50% of the members are women. So to conclude, solutions to food security and forest conservation will lie not only in new technologies, practices, and financial support, but in new institutional innovations, locally and globally. In particular, we need innovative forms of cooperation and collective action, in which the poor and women are seen not just as the main victims of the food and environmental crisis, but also as a central part of the solution. I believe it is time to build new associations and strategic connections. So let me echo Lydia Brito when she asked, are we ready to form those alliances? Thank you.
Thanks so much, Bina. Lots of ideas there, lots of practical examples, which will live in the memory. Someone here has sent us, someone from Stockholm has sent us a tweet wanting to know more about your ideas about restoring water resources, the community-led recharge of water. And At the Green, Mary is asking, are there limits to this? A great idea, but really, how far can it go?
Well, in countries which have intensive monsoons, a lot of water, you have a lot of rain, but in very short period spells of time. I think this is a very important element. And it is not just in South Asia. I was talking to somebody over breakfast in Jordan. They're doing this in many other countries. I think this is a very, very important mechanism. for recharging groundwater.
And
cities.
Enough. And cities?
And cities. I mean, you take a city like Delhi, you have rainwater harvesting systems now in many colonies. You know, you water the parks, the gardens, and this is one way forward.
Okay. So what's going on in villages in India, we can really replicate wherever we are.
You can replicate on a vast scale with community cooperation, I believe.
Bina, thank you so much.
Thank you.
For joining us. Bina Agarwal there. Lots of ideas, water recharge to forestry programs, community action, putting women at the heart of it.